while ago in the Facebook group, we discussed this video a little bit, and it was about a BJJ black belt sharing his observations about defending against a knife in a training environment. So he'd have one of his training partners or students attack him with a training knife, and then he shares his opinions. We discussed a little bit, and the reason why I find it interesting is because it's sometimes very difficult to make people see this obvious point, and that is that the training methodology needs to be consistent enough with parameters in reality to be very valuable. Or you need to understand that you're leaving out certain parameters, and these are actually quite important in the real thing, so that when you train without them, you know that you're training specific things that may apply in real life or not. And if they don't apply, you need to know why you train that way anyway. What am I talking about? Well, in that video, he is in an octagon with a training partner with a training knife, and that partner then tries to stab him. Now, what we see in that video is the black belt is moving around as if it's a competitive match. For instance, leaning forward, as if you're going to just grab somebody by the neck and clinch and so on, like you see in BJJ tournaments. So this forward-leaning stance, close to a wrestler stance, and so on, moving in and out, just hopping around, the footwork very light and agile, and so on. But then also totally leaving out striking techniques, and that was one of the comments of one of my forum members, is that where's the striking? Because if you leave out the striking when you're training defense against the knife, well, you're taking away one of the primary tools that you might have to use there. By simply focusing on only grappling, that's all you're going to do, you're basically taking out this component that, as I mentioned in the beginning, might be extremely important, which falsifies the training drill a little bit, which gives you false positives in this and false negatives, in the sense that you leave out the striking, you revert to only grappling, and then you end up with getting stabbed by the training knife a bunch of times. And the conclusion is then, well, this doesn't work. Or I think the black belt said something along the lines of, like, if a black belt can't even defend against a blue belt with a knife, then this doesn't work. That is not a logical conclusion. The one that's a non sequitur, the one doesn't follow from the other. Because maybe there's something fundamentally wrong with your approach. And one of the things that I said in that discussion is that when you look at the old Gracie Jiu-Jitsu videotapes, like the really old ones on self-defense several decades ago, what you see is still very close to the original Jiu-Jitsu that was taught in Japan traditionally, and had a very strong self-defense focus. Now, the techniques looked very traditional as well, because in the way that they were presented, as in and I forget who it was. I think it was Horian and Hoyce Gracie doing those videos, but I could be wrong. It's been so many years since I saw them. And it looked very traditional how when I started with Jiu-Jitsu as a teenager, Jiu-Jitsu and Judo, that was how we would train. Very traditional, very Japanese. You would bow to your training partner. He would set up his attack. You do his attack. You allow him to do the attack, let him grab you, choke you, whatever it is, and then you perform your technique step by step and so on. Very, very rigid training schedule, regimen, not at all free-flowing, not at all, totally in a sparring context, but very, very strictly regimented, like how you can move. This is very Japanese, in the sense that Japanese martial arts tend to train like that, and others as well. But the etiquette and the rules that apply on how you train are pretty clear there. And I remember back then that a lot of people were commenting like, okay, this is nothing special. I mean, these kinds of videos of self-defense techniques, we've seen that over and over for the past decades. There's nothing all that spectacular about it. I'm not going to argue either for or against that. What I would say is that compared to some of the, for instance, World War II combatives, some of the Fairbairn and Sykes stuff that is available, and Fairburn himself was also, the way that he would present some of his stuff was very clearly in that tradition as well, even though he was a no-nonsense guy and not at all a traditionalist. My point is that when you don't train with that specific background, so the self-defense aspect of jiu-jitsu, and you hyper focus on the competitive aspect, nothing wrong with that. But then you specialize. You specialize in a specific way of training. And I think that is something that you have to be aware of, that you're doing that. And then all of a sudden you branch out of that specialization, but you take your tools that you acquired in that specialized way of training and you try to apply them outside of that context. And if your conclusion is then, well, if I can't make it work and I'm a black belt, then for sure you can't make it work. Where maybe the conclusion should be that, well, we've specialized in a certain direction with the martial art that we practice, but maybe that specialization isn't not universal, I should say, in its application. Maybe it doesn't work in many other contexts. Maybe it does. But when you run into the limitations, you shouldn't just say like, well, we give up, this doesn't work. And I'm not saying that that is the message in this video. I'm speaking more broadly now. But I would say that then maybe you need to look at your approach and how you test things. One of the most difficult aspects of training knife defense is that it is very, very hard to simulate reality. Because it's a training environment and you can't really strike full force like you should when somebody comes at you with a knife, meaning that if you are lucky enough to deflect the first incoming attack so you don't get stabbed or slashed, and then you manage to hit the guy with whatever technique that you do, whether it involves grappling as well or not, you need to basically try to end the fight right then and there. Hit him so hard that he's out. If you use striking, and it's not a bad idea to use striking techniques in that regard. The difference is that you're not going to do like a jab, cross hook, lead hook, uppercut combination. It's not a boxing match. The goals are very different. So if you take away certain tools, well, you're going to get a faulty test, in my opinion. And inherent in the testing is that it cannot incorporate certain elements like full contact striking, which is what you should need, which very often leads to situations in which you end up coming to conclusions and favoring certain techniques that work, quote unquote, during that testing. But the only reason they work is because you've limited the test to certain parameters and you left out a bunch of others. It's like learning to swim, on the side of the pool. You look at the water, can't swim just yet. Okay, you lie down on the side of the pool and you start making swimming motions. This is the analogy that Peyton Quinn used to make people understand that scenario training is not the same thing as traditional training. I think there's a valid point there. Now, I'm not trying to, put on blast the guy making a video, not at all. I'm just trying to point something out that is very common in martial arts and also outside of that, of just not being able to think outside of the box that you create for yourself. And also having a certain interpretation of what the realities of violence are like. Something I've said many, many times before is that nobody knows everything about violence. You cannot. It's impossible. You cannot be the hyper specialist in every area of violence because you simply have one lifetime. It's not enough. There's a huge difference between somebody who's working the doors at some dive bar in a really bad part of town. It's very different from somebody working the door in a high-end club somewhere in a big city, which is still very different from somebody who is deployed in a war zone overseas and has to fight in that context, which is very different also from one area of operations to the other. Fighting in Afghanistan is not the same thing as fighting in the jungles of Africa. It's just not the same, and that's also not the same as fighting in Antarctica when it's freezing cold and conditions are radically different. All these people that I mentioned, these examples, they all know how they know violence, they understand it because they operate in that environment and have to confront it. But they all have different priorities, different techniques, different mindsets, different tactics, strategies, and so on. You won't be able to do it all. And the thing I see, and because BJJ and MMA are now like the dominant combat sports, is that you see people, and this is something I predicted years ago, is that they start with these combat sports that are really good for certain things, and now they want to reverse engineer these into self-defense. Some things carry over, some things don't. Like I said, if you specialize in a rule set, a specific area of sports, of combat sports, it doesn't automatically all translate well into self-defense. Some things yes, some things not so much. How can you make up your mind as to which part does and which doesn't? That is the difficult part. But making assumptions about this is what gets people killed. Because if you just assume, well, this stuff, this makes sense to me, so I'm sure that this will carry over into a self-defense context, just assuming it doesn't work. And especially if you're teaching it, I think that's a really bad idea to do so. So here's me making the argument that some humility for all of us is always a good idea. Nobody knows everything, including me. Again, my Facebook group, the name is You Are Not Ares, God of War. The only person who knows everything is a mythological god of war. He knows everything about violence. The rest of us, we at best know a little piece. So some humility is good, but also trying to avoid to always think from our own context, from our specialization, from what we have experienced and trained in, and then thinking that that applies to everything else, to all the other aspects of violence that are out there. Right, so guys, so this was a shorter episode. Next week, I'm going to put online the interview that I did with Brian Drake, the author. Really fun interview, and I hope you guys will enjoy that as well. As always, like, share, subscribe, follow me on Patreon for a bunch of extra unique content available nowhere else. And I'll talk to you next time.